Hello and welcome back to my channel where I talk about my life in Japan on the JET program. So if any of that interests you, then be sure to subscribe. I've made a few videos now actually about what teaching in Japan is really like, but this time I'm going to specifically be focusing on whether or not or when you should use Japanese in the classroom. I mean, I don't speak Japanese myself, and you're encouraged certainly by the schools not to use any Japanese at all in the classroom, and that's why you don't need any kind of Japanese qualification or speaking level or ability when you apply to the JET program. It's not necessary. But you know, that's very much in theory. In practice, of course, every situation is different. If you're at a higher level school, you'll probably just very easily communicate what you want to in English and they will understand, I'm sure, a lot of the time. At the other end of the scale, when I used to work at a technical night school, every single word I said was directly translated to Japanese. Every instruction, every explanation, everything. Otherwise, there's just no way that any class there would be able to be run because the level is just that low. But the school I'm working at full-time now, 5 days a week, is very mid-level. And so I personally think using Japanese just a little bit actually benefits the student's ability to learn English. So yeah, that's the topic of today's video. That's what I'm going to be diving into. I'll be talking about using lots of Japanese, using zero Japanese, the pros and cons of both, and when I personally think is the best times to use Japanese, because recently I've been including a lot more Japanese in my lessons than I used to. So on one end of the scale, I have my Japanese teacher, one of them specifically, who is very strict, 100% A go all the time, no Japanese.
God give me fucking strength.
And that certainly has its pros and cons. So the pros, the students know they can't rely on Japanese, they can't fall back on it. They know the JTE ain't gonna tell them the answer in Japanese if they ask. So they pay a lot more attention to me when I'm using English, and they try a lot harder, they put more effort in because, for example, if I ask them to talk about something with their partner and then I'll pick some students to tell me their answers in English, they know if they're called, they will have no choice but to use English. So like, they want to be ready. But cons wise, it certainly makes a lot of activities take a lot longer. So for example, recently I've been running a series of lessons on roleplay, specifically roleplay situations where the students will potentially meet foreigners in the future. For one of those lessons, I had them brainstorm ideas for situations where that might happen, where they might interact with a foreigner. And that could have been meeting international students at uni or college, a stranger coming up to them on the street to ask for help or directions or something. Anything was okay. And so I give them some time to talk with their partner, and in most classes I would choose some people or volunteers and they would tell me their answer in Japanese. The JTE would tell me what that means in English and I would write the English on the board so they can see how to say that in English. But in classes with this one JTE, he ain't gonna say nothing in Japanese. So I'll call on a student and they'll try and say it in Japanese and the JTE will be like, oh, English, and they don't know how.
I'm terrified.
So they're just staring and panicking and the whole class is just, this is awkward.
It's crickets in here. Mute button, everybody's mouth is zipped shut, no one has anything to say.
I don't even know what they're trying to say because I don't understand the Japanese, so I can't even give them like a hint or anything.
I don't have an explanation for you, and you may not get one. That's it. As far as I'm concerned, the issue is dead. I'm moving forward.
I only end up writing like 2 or 3 examples on the board in those classes, and then instead of 10 minutes, the activity can take 15 or 20. Waste of time. I actually plan to make a video about the roleplay series of classes that I'm doing because they're running super smoothly. It's been a great experience. So if you're interested in hearing about those classes, then definitely do subscribe so you don't miss it. Then you've got the other approach where there are some JTEs who at the slightest difficulty will jump in there with the Japanese. Sometimes even the students don't have enough time to process what I've said in English before the JTE has translated it to Japanese, and I'm just like, I mean, you could let them try sometimes, you know? I mean, the pros, there certainly are pros, is that the lessons run a lot more smoothly, a lot more quickly, and the students are generally a lot more relaxed and not so like tense and nervous all the time because they know they have like a safety net if they can't express something in English fully. But this does mean cons-wise that students can be lazy, put in a lot less effort because they know that they don't really need to be able to say something in English because the JTE will just tell them what the answer is, what it means in Japanese. For example, one warm-up I did was spot the difference. I had 2 pictures on the TV, they had to find the differences and tell me the differences in English. And it was really simple English they could use. All the other classes were able to do it, but there's some classes who like, I'll pick a student and they won't even try, they'll immediately look at the JTE and be like, sensei, how do I, and they'll ask in Japanese, how do I say blah blah blah. Teacher will say it in English and they'll just repeat what the teacher says, and they're not trying, they're not learning anything, they probably don't even know what they said sometimes, so that kind of sucks. Personally though, I believe everything needs balance, and there are some cases where Japanese is called for and some cases where it isn't.
Sometimes.
Always?
Not always, no. Sometimes. That means sometimes.
Unfortunately though, a lot of the time it is dependent on the JTE. What do you think is better if you have to go one extreme or the other? Because I can't decide which of those styles of teaching from a JTE I prefer working with. I really can't. What do you think is better and why? Yeah, what do you think? Let me know in the comments. But yeah, absolutely Japanese has its place in the classroom. So here are the situations where I will do my best to use Japanese. So the first one is any idea generation or brainstorming activities. I mentioned earlier, for example, when they were brainstorming, situations they may talk with foreigners in. Another example is last semester I did a project with them for a bunch of lessons where they had to make a sales pitch for a product I provided for them, and it was just an image of this really wacky, weird, random product that I found online. Didn't tell them what it was or what it did. They had to decide for themselves, like, what is the purpose of this product? What are the features? What's like an example use case or situation that it would be used in?
And I'm known as the daddy of the Scrub Daddy, the cutest but most high-tech scrubbing tool in the world.
I give them like a big brainstorming sheet and they work away at it, and I'm like, do this in Japanese, like absolutely. Because if they use English, well, first of all, they might be thinking of pretty complicated concepts which they won't know the English for. They might have a great idea, but if they don't immediately know how to express that in English, then they might just discard it completely. Or, on the other hand, they may spend the whole time brainstorming just trying to translate one idea to English, and then they don't actually think of very many ideas and reach their best one. Ultimately, whatever idea they settle on, they're gonna have to work on expressing it in English further down the line to give their presentation. But for the brainstorming activity specifically, for idea generation, it's not about learning English, it's about coming up with ideas to use when we then move on to English activities, you know? I just think it's way less productive to use English in those kinds of activities and way more time consuming. In general, just like with any creative task I give them, even in Japanese, they can struggle to come up with ideas. So they need a minute to think in Japanese, to think of those ideas, and I just want them to get that down on paper so they can see the possibilities before we even begin to tackle English. Okay, so the next time is probably the most simple, and it's just to get the kids' attention. A lot of the time when they're working on something or they're not doing anything and they're just chatting to each other if it's a more problematic class, and I try and get their attention, I'll be like, okay everybody, pencils down, let's go for the answers, clap my hands, whatever. But like, a lot of the time it just goes right over their head. They're not processing the English because their mind is doing something else. And so sometimes in those instances, I'll be like, sumimasen, minasan. They get shook that I've used any Japanese because they know I don't speak Japanese and they just don't expect it from my voice. So they're always in those moments just like, oh.
What the fuck is going on in here on this day?
And then they'll see I'm waiting, and then they'll pay attention again. And finally, I've been using a lot more Japanese recently, especially within these roleplay lessons, and I've become a lot less hesitant to use it. And the reason is because for these lessons, I've been using Japanese to help me prioritize more useful activities to use English in. And this is usually due to time limitations. So in this case, I only have 4 lessons to dedicate to roleplay, and the 4th one is a test. So actually I only have 3 to introduce the topic, to teach them the topic, and to practice the topic. That's not a lot of time. For example, in the 3rd lesson, which I've just run, I explained to them how they're going to be graded on their test and how the test is going to be run. And usually what I've done in the past is try and explain on the board, and I'll really dumb down the English, but it just doesn't make it clear, or it means the grading criteria have to be very vague and simply expressed. Whereas this time I just did everything in Japanese. I gave them a handout, which I got the JTE to translate properly into Japanese for me. It's very detailed, it's very clear, and they'll know how to be tested. Otherwise, I would spend 20 minutes explaining what's on this paper, making sure they understand, asking them questions to make sure they understand, and so on. And even if I did all that, there would probably be a couple students who still didn't fully get it. It's a test. They need to understand how it's going to work and what's expected of them. So this time I was like, nah. I'ma just give them this sheet, then I'ma give them some time to ask questions, and then we'll move on.
Oh my goodness. Let's see what the answers are.
And I feel like as well it makes them less nervous for the test because they're very clear on what's going to go down. The point of this lesson isn't to learn the English for marking criteria. That's not what I'm teaching, it's roleplay. The time should be dedicated to role-playing. Maybe if I had like 5 or 6 classes I could dedicate, I would do it in English. But I don't have time for that. Feeling very hyped up because I feel very strongly about this, and I think I'm going to use more Japanese going forward now, having had this really positive role-playing experience.
I've got big plans for this place, and I'm not gonna stop, yeah?
So again, I'm going to be posting a video about that whole series of lessons, so again, do subscribe so you don't miss it. Also, I gave an explanation of how I am going to run that roleplay test, as well as how I've run tests in the past, in a bonus video on my Patreon page. So if you're curious about that, or just other bonus content in general, behind the scenes of my videos, teaching, general life, and other content as well, then you can check out my Patreon. The link is in the description. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I hope you understand why using Japanese in those situations ultimately benefits the students when it comes to learning English. Do you agree with me? What do you think? Comment below, what are your thoughts? Because this is just my opinion.
That's my opinion!
So yeah, let me know what you think, absolutely. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it interesting, then leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys next week. Okay, bye!